we do have our next speaker is Jocelyn Benson, as I mentioned earlier. And as Democrats who lived through the 2000 election and the 8 years that followed, we know that having fair elections really matters in this country. And our next speaker is very committed to improving elections in Michigan. Jocelyn Benson is an election law professor at Wayne State University's Law School and founder of the Richard Austin Center for Election Law and Administration, which works with local officials to try to improve the administration of elections. She has established a committee to run for Michigan Secretary of State next year. As an attorney, she also serves as a member of the Standing Committee on Election Law of the Bar Association. Prior to her appointment as a professor, Ms. Benson served as a law clerk for the Honorable Damon J. Heath on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And during the 2004 election, she was hired to develop the first nationwide election protection program for the Democratic National Committee. And she also served on coordinator of the Harvard Civil Rights Project, where she helped to pass the Help America Vote Act. She has a book coming out in the fall, Democracy in the Secretary, which will highlight the crucial role that a Secretary of State's office can play in protecting the integrity of elections. So I will now ask you to please welcome Jocelyn Benson.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here this evening. I just want to talk really briefly about the emphasis that I think we all need to place on that Secretary of State's office in 2010. And as some of you know, I grew up not in Alabama, which is a pesky rumor. I used to live in Alabama, but I was actually born in Pittsburgh. And my parents were both special education teachers, so it was instilled in me really early on and throughout my life the importance of access to health care, education, and the vote. And I went to college and got very involved in politics and ran for office and represented my college in the town council in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and then found myself in Alabama. In Montgomery, Alabama, where I was involved in social justice issues for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Great organization. For those of you who don't know about it, it's a civil rights law firm headed by Morris Dees. And one of their centerpieces is that it's the only nonprofit in the country that investigates white supremacists and neo-Nazis and uses the information to sue the organizations that commit hate crimes as a way of minimizing their impact. So I was one of those folks who went undercover and investigated and gathered information on white supremacist groups, neo-Nazis, organizations, and those sorts of things. But living in Alabama, the cradle of the civil rights movement, really instilled in me this commitment to recognizing the importance of all of our voices to be heard and the power of our democratic system in promoting that, and the fact that so many lives have been risked in the past, particularly in Alabama, to ensure that everyone could have that right to vote that is in the Constitution. And living in Montgomery and going to Selma, Alabama, where those lives were really risked and some were lost, and the battle for democracy really instilled in me this need and commitment to basically do whatever I could with my life to ensure that those protections were real, that those battles that had been fought to make our country really the best democracy in the world were not in vain, and that I wanted to do everything I could to basically continue to protect that avenue to democracy. And so that to me at the time meant fighting on the federal level for the Voting Rights Act reauthorization, fighting to enforce those federal protections for voters. And then the 2000 election happened. We all remember, as just mentioned, what happened. Florida, 535 votes, and an early certification of the election by a Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, that changed the course of our country's history. And I think for the first time, many of us saw just how powerful one person can be in stopping not only a vote from being counted, but removing people from the rolls wrongly, so that when they showed up on election day, they found that they couldn't vote because they were no longer on the registration list. So we saw one person having this significant impact on blocking democracy, blocking the vote, and changing the course of the election. So I said, okay, I'm going to get involved in these election protection efforts, and I was asked by the Democratic National Party in D.C. to work with the John Kerry and John Edwards campaign at the time to set up what was the first time in our country's history where the Democratic Party would be placing lawyers at the polls. Many of you probably were some of our attorneys in Michigan. Lawyers at the polls on election day to make sure the law was followed, to make sure there were no shenanigans, nothing happened, no one was blocked from voting wrongly. And so we set up that effort. I trained and recruited lawyers in about 21 states, 17,000 lawyers total. And then what happened in 2004? Ohio, right? Remember Ohio? And again, we had a Secretary of State, Ken Blackwell, in Ohio, making small decisions like not putting enough machines in Cleveland, putting too many machines in rural areas, and basically, again, with one position, one person, using his office to alter the course of the election. Now, he, like Katherine Harris, was also not only the Secretary of State, but the co-chair of the Bush campaign, which is a significant problem. And by the way, our Secretary of State, Terry Lynn Land, also at the time was the co-chair of the Bush campaign in 2004. But it was a significant problem because, again, we saw how one Secretary of State, one person, could implement policies that could change the course of the democracy and change our election and change the outcome of the election, arguably. And then in 2006, we saw the election of Jennifer Brunner in Ohio, and another Secretary of State, a new Secretary of State who was an attorney, not a politician, got involved and said, I want to make sure Ohio has some of the best elections in the country. And in just 2 years, she was able to completely turn around. Without the help of the Ohio legislature, which is dominated by Republicans, she, a Democratic Secretary of State, was able to issue 65 directives in 1 year and basically clean up Ohio's system of elections. Now, Michigan, as you know, we're not Florida, and we're definitely not Ohio. We actually have a strong history of being an innovator in elections. Under Richard Austin, who many of you probably remember, served as Secretary of State for 20 years, and he led the way for national policy to enable people to register to vote when they get their driver's licenses. That came out of our Secretary of State's office. Michigan, under him, was seen as an innovator. We were at the lead of how elections should be run. We were a state that people looked to for ideas. So we have that great history in our state, but we've drifted away from that in recent years. And what we've seen recently is, in 2006, people lying to our voters about a ballot initiative, and they got on the ballot, and it was not investigated by the Secretary of State. In 2007, we saw the closure of branch offices throughout our state, including Buena Vista Township, which I fought to keep open successfully because we argued that it violated the Voting Rights Act to close that branch office. That was another problem. And then 2008 came along, and in September of 2008, many of you may remember there were rumors that emerged out of Macomb County that people would be showing up on election day using foreclosure lists and saying if your house was being foreclosed, you wouldn't have the right to vote. You wouldn't be able to cast your ballot. Completely false. Now, there's nothing specifically in Michigan election law, though, that says if your home is being foreclosed, you can't vote. But it's implied in the law that you don't need to, and we know you don't need to own property in order to vote. And so what the Secretary of State in Ohio did, with same rumors, same problem, she came out the next day, a voice for the voters, and said, not in our state will anyone be blocked from voting because they're dealing with foreclosure or any other financial difficulties. Our Secretary of State was silent. I went to Congress, testified before the John Conyers House Judiciary Committee, and said we need our Secretary of States and all Secretary of States to come out and be a voice for voters, be a champion for voters, and say, not in our state will you be blocked from voting because you're facing foreclosure. It's against the law to do that. We didn't get that. We eventually got the Director of Elections to issue a small directive attesting to the fact that it was illegal to challenge people from voting when their homes are in foreclosure, but we never had that voice from the Secretary of State. And so after now almost a decade of working to improve elections and protect voters, and seeing really that Secretary of State's office is crucial, is the linchpin for ensuring that our democratic principles are protected and that all voters in our state have access to democracy, I decided I'm going to run for Secretary of State because I know that what we need in that office is not necessarily a career politician, but someone who knows the law, someone who's going to adhere to the law, and on every day, every moment, make sure that office is used to serve every single one of you in this room and every citizen in the state of Michigan equally. I want everyone to have